Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 89. General Savary, Duke of Rovigo, and Napoleon's second police chief. As a reminder, if you'd like to support our podcast, please go to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon. If you'd like to support our podcast in other ways, please go to YouTube, find Generals and Napoleon, and hit the subscribe button. As always, we appreciate your support. Now, on with the show. We have a fantastic guest on the line today, all the way from Singapore, my good friend Jonas Deneve. How are you, Jonas?
Hey, John. Happy to finally make it for your show. I know I've been delaying it a little bit, but happy to be here finally, and humbled to be part of this.
Oh, well, I'm honored to have you on as well. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
For those of you who don't know Jonas, he has a wonderful blog and a Twitter page, just really detailed firsthand accounts of the Napoleonic era. It's called napoleonicchronicles.wordpress.com. And Jonas, could you tell us a little bit about what we'd find there?
I'm really a big fan of reading eyewitness accounts, so memoirs, letters. And for me, I felt there was it's like a niche that I really wanted to get into. And so what I started doing is translate mostly French or French allied accounts. There's such a great rabbit hole to get into, and through the blog, I actually want to give people the opportunity to read some of the more overlooked accounts, or some of them that have been released only recently, or mostly those that have been overlooked, because through time there's the outpour of these matters is so big, it's easily to get overwhelmed. So I want to bring them back in the spotlight.
Yeah, and I think that's a great thing that you're doing, because it's pretty easy to hop online. You can dig up Napoleon's letters, or even Marshal, Murat, or Ney's letters, but to find the letters of like a conscript or a captain or like a primary sources like that, I think, and that's why I enjoy your blog so much. I think that's really cool to see just not only the opinions of Napoleon or the campaigns, but just how they live from day to day.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And it's just such a great variety, right? So I tend to focus more on the accounts that, or letters that are written during like the main empire period, so 1804 till 1815. But so even then, I don't really give much attention yet to for accounts written during the revolutionary period, like the Egyptian campaign, or even what the other side said, in France, men from counter-revolutionary ideals, or the people who were keen on the monarchy, how did they see the man Napoleon, or what were their views on the war and society back then? It's really fascinating.
Yeah, and Jonas has written a few books, and he's just a very talented guy, so I'm super excited to have him on the show. Who are we discussing today? Who's our focus for this episode?
Yeah, this Jean-Marie Savary.
Yeah, Savary, as I call him. He's an interesting character, like most of Napoleon's lieutenants. He had his good moments and bad moments. What is your kind of thumbnail sketch overview of Savary?
Yeah, so there are a few points that we can focus on when we talk about Savary. There can be no mistake in understanding the fact that Savary was loyal to Napoleon and his regime. His career is a testimony to that. He's a known figure, but he's been rather sidelined by other generals, and then especially by the marshals, right? So that's already one thing. And personally, I kind of feel that Savary was quite the firebrand. He got himself involved in some dark matters, especially like the Duke of Enghien affair, which we're gonna cover. And his obscure side also kind of showed during his time as Minister of Police. So yeah, all that makes him very interesting and quite intriguing. So
let's kind of start from the beginning. He was born in April 1774, and I'll let you pronounce the French town.
Right. It was at Marc at the Chateau d'Erouet. which was, Marc is a village in the Argonne region, which is between Vuisier and Varennes in the northeast of France.
Okay. What do we know of his early childhood?
Yeah, so he was the third son of Pons Savary, who was an officer who managed to become a knight of the Royal and Military Order of Saint Louis. And his father attained the rank of major pretty much thanks to his long service record. So he's pretty much like a self-made man. Savary's mother was Victoire Lors de Sauzet. She was a daughter of an engineer to the King of France. And Savary's brother, he served in the artillery, and he was actually acquainted to Napoleon already at La Fère and Brienne. So this is actually quite interesting. And so despite his father also acquiring a fiefdom, the fiefdom of Marc, can't really say that, the Savary family was extremely well-to-do, or they were of like a very prestigious descent. They were pretty much like I said, a self-made family, and it's quite interesting for at least for the time that they were living in.
Yeah, but I couldn't tell if he was an aristocratic background, so it sounds like he was, but they weren't like a rich, giant family of France.
Yeah. He only mentions mentions this only in a few lines in the first volume of his memoirs, but from what we can tell from his father's correspondence, which was consulted by Thierry Lenz, who is an eminent French historian who wrote the best biography on the general. I read it a few years ago. From that consultation, we can actually tell that Pons was, he was the leading character of the family, because Victoire, Savary's mother, she passed away when he was 7. So, what Pons decided on obviously determined what the children would do. So, and he was quite stern and disciplinary due to, being a lifetime soldier, but he was also quite affectionate. And there's actually also mentions from those letters that Pons would call his boys gros canailles, which you can translate as rascals. And or he would end his letters to them with your affectionate papa. So, he wasn't that rough after all.
Right. Well, he seems to be well educated growing up. When did he join the military?
And so by August of 1790, when Savary was 16, he joined the cavalry regiment, the Royal Normandie, in which his father served. So being young, is a 16-year-old lad, he joined the army pretty much like out of the sense of duty. So there's not really a sense of like revolutionary ideas, because at that time we're already 1 year into the French Revolutions.
Yeah, and he becomes a lieutenant basically the year after, 1791, and then captain quickly thereafter that. What was his first baptism of fire in a battle?
Yeah, for him, it's quite a special one. So we still first have to stay around August 1790, because Savary's regiment was part of a suppression of a soldiers' revolt against the officers, which officers at the time in the French army were mostly from the nobility. And this took place at the garrison of Nancy. And the suppression was led by General Dubouillet, who was still loyal to the monarchy, the cause of the monarchy, right? So basically, the suppression was actually his first action in the field.
Okay.
So and this the putting down of the revolt was used to serve as a severe example that basically the Royalist faction was still in charge of the country, which you can debate, right? It was one of many in a period of mutiny and suppression that followed in its wake. So as a result of the immigration of large swathes of Royalist officers who attempted to escape the revolutionary turmoil, Savary was promoted, as you said, to second lieutenant on the 15th of September of 1791. And then by 1792, he served in General Custines' army, who opposed the forces of the Duke of Brunswick, also in northern France. And after this campaign, and after Custines' demise, as a result of the latter being denounced after a failed attack at Mainz, both by representatives of government in the field and his own troops, Savary became a captain. he found his way to become a liaison officer to General Pichegru and General Moreau during the Rhine campaigns. So, and we know that these gentlemen had some mixed attitudes towards the revolutionary cause. And it's interesting to note that Savary would, indirectly encounter them again once he took on his police missions under Napoleon.
Yeah, Pichegru and Moreau, definitely not fans of Napoleon. Well, he works his way up, like you said. He becomes an aide to the talented General Desai, and he serves both Desai and Napoleon in the 1798 Egyptian conquest. How did this campaign go?
Yeah, so for Savary, he led the landing forces of Desai's division during the conquest of Malta and Alexandria in Egypt. And he also took part in the Battle of the Pyramids. And in his memoirs, he actually very interestingly describes the engagement as follows, and I quote, "We had scarcely time to give the alarm and open our fire when we found that this formidable cavalry had already surrounded us. So great had been the rapidity of its charge that we were unable to alter the position of our two divisions, which massed one another to nearly the extent of half a battalion in front. The danger was pressing. We commenced firing, never supposing that the two divisions, which were only 100 paces asunder, would be under the necessity of keeping up a fire towards those parts of their flank fronts which masked one another for a few yards. The contrary, however, came to pass. The charge of the Mamelukes was extremely impetuous in our front, which a fire of grape shot and musketry brought the men and horses down in heaps around our squares." So yeah, it's quite interesting how he,
that's quite detailed, and that was a huge victory.
However, as we know, at least military-wise, we know that the campaign turned out for the worst in Napoleon's case. So one of the other highlights for Savary's case was that he attended the negotiations that would take place between Desai, who was sent out by General Kléber, who took command of the army when Napoleon fled the country.
Yep.
And so negotiations between Desai and the infamous Sir Sidney Smith, to have the French forces return home. Yeah, and Smith was quite a thorn in Napoleon's side in a few moments in his life, I must say.
Yeah, definitely. Eventually Desai and Savary and the French are basically, they surrender, I think, in 1801. They're repatriated. Actually, that's before that, 1800. And they get back just in time for the Battle of Marengo. And what happens here?
Yeah, so Savary still served under Desai as his first aide-de-camp during the Second Italian Campaign, up to the Battle of Marengo, as you said, where he was killed. And it was there that, Desai was, struck in the chest by a canister round, and it exited through his shoulder blade. So it was quite a brutal but quick death. So by that time, we have to remember that Savary served under Desai for a long time. So he had a great affection for him, and he admired his talent and humanity. And he was actually the one who found his superior's body, which he recognized by the abundant black hair that Desai had. If you see portraits of him, you'll know about this. Napoleon himself also was very close to Desai, and he was really impressed by how Savary had such unwavering loyalty and willpower. And it was there that the future emperor appointed Savary to become his aide-de-camp as well as a confidant.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Desai probably would have been one of the original marshals of the empire.
For sure. Yeah. The man was extremely talented. Life cut short.
The interesting part, though, I think, is that Marshal Davout also worked under Desai. So not only did Napoleon take Davout under his wing, it sounds like he took Savary under his wing as well.
Oh, he was quite keen on doing that. Like he would notice people of certain talents and then put them under his wing. Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, in 1801, like you said, Savary becomes colonel of the gendarmes assigned to protect Napoleon.
Yes.
There's also a police force in France under the control of the sinister Fouché.
Right.
Can you explain the difference between these two groups?
Yeah, so the gendarmes they are basically a rebranding of what in France was called the maréchaussée, which was already like an institution, that dates back from the Middle Ages. So the mission of the police and the gendarmerie is fairly the same. So they have to defend national institutions and interests. They have to maintain peace and public order, and they have to protect individuals and property. But the difference is that there are a few differences, but one, you have to note that the policemen were civil servants, whereas the gendarmes were soldiers. And the elite gendarmes, they were actually part of the Imperial Guard, and it's to that unit that Savary was given command of.
Okay.
Then you also have like the geographical area of operations, which is a difference. So both forces have jurisdiction over the whole of France. The National Police Force operates mainly in and around major cities, whereas the gendarmes, on the other hand, they operated in rural and suburban areas, as well as on major roads. And then you would have them follow the army, mostly in the rear, with orders to, for instance, capture deserters.
Yeah.
And as you said, they could also act as a bodyguard of a general staff. They enforced conscription. They helped collect taxes.
Yeah.
And they also, most importantly, they also helped suppressing banditry, which was quite an issue in France prior to the revolution. The force kept improving, and even by 1808, the gendarmerie was considered a legion, and they were, for instance, sent off to Spain, where they would fight the guerrillas, in addition to upholding their law enforcement duties. So there you can see that they could also be employed beyond the borders of France, and we know from eyewitness accounts that they were quite a force a force that was feared in the annexed territories of the empire.
Right. I just think it's interesting. Savary's trained as a soldier, but basically he kind of learns how to be a policeman as well during this time.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. And even besides those tasks, the gendarmerie also could act as heavy cavalry, as they also did at the Battle of Medina de Rio Seco of the 14th of July 1808. When then they were actually also, a part of them was recalled for the Russian campaign, and the gendarmes would draw swords at the Berezina crossing, at Leipzig and Montmirail. So they were all, in a way, they were also quite unique and different police forces. Right. So they were intended to reinforce one another, but you also have to realize that they were in addition used as cross-service supervision.
Right.
So it shouldn't be a surprise that especially the rivalry of Fouché and Savary would become a matter as the years went on. Yeah.
Well, I think it's also wise. You don't want any one group to become too powerful, so you kind of break up the power between the different.
Oh yeah, definitely under Fouché.
Yeah. Well, in 1802, Savary gets married. Could you tell us a bit about his personal life?
Yeah, so due to that link with Napoleon, he actually became an intimate member of the Bonaparte family, and he was regularly invited to parties at the Malmaison. And it was actually there that he met his wife, Félicité de Faudois, who is a distant relative of Josephine. So Félicité, she was 17 years old at the time. And like Josephine, Félicité was a Creole. So she was born in the French Caribbean. And she was also a classmate to Hortense.
Napoleon's stepdaughter, yeah.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. So it was with the consent of First Consul Bonaparte that the couple got married on the 27th of February of 1802. And the couple went to have 7 children. So it was a relatively happy marriage for the time. But we all know, neither spouse was faithful. This used to happen in a lot of these families. So one of Savary's mistresses was the Madame du Eylau, who then later on became a mistress to none other than Louis XVIII.
Oh, wow.
And Félicité herself, she also had a lover who was General Sebastiani.
Oh, yeah, and Sebastiani,
yeah. And he is believed to have fathered the youngest son. who would become the French writer and adventurer Gustave Aimard. So yeah, that's also a fun fact.
Well, in 1803, he gets promoted again to general of brigade, and he also starts to become pretty good at finding assassins and uncovering plots against Napoleon.
Right.
Why do you think he was so? Why did he excel in this area?
Yeah, it's a combination of factors. So his employment as like liaison officer, staff officer, being an aide-de-camp, all these roles require you to gather intelligence from locals. Having spies employed, you have to do networking. Grants you, a form of independence, which then also bolsters, administrative skills. So, all those factors together with Savary's rather reserved yet duty-driven attitude, I think for Napoleon, that made like a solid combination to fit the general in the policing role and the special assignments. So I have an example of it that following the Battle of Marengo in the summer of 1800. So he says, I was directed by the First Council to repair secretly to Italy and inform myself of the state of defense and the resources of the several towns which had been surrendered to us, and also the state of our parks of artillery, depots, and cavalry. He handed me a letter for the Minister of the Treasury, who delivered into my charge 1,000,000 of francs in gold for the treasurer of the army. This circumstance rendered my journey a perilous one. I was carrying with me a considerable sum of money, and was obliged to cross a country where, for the sake of a few pieces of gold, the people would have taken away my life. The passage of Mont Cenis, where the carriages had to be taken to pieces, placed me under the necessity of exhibiting my 10 little barrels well sealed up and containing each 100,000 francs. So from that moment, I became indifferent to everything, so convinced that I could never reach my destination in safety. So I avoided quitting my carriage either for the purpose of eating it or drinking. And when compelled to leave it, I took care only to do so at night. I must, however, own it to the credit of the Savoyard peasantry that they loaded my barrels, the value of which they well knew, without manifesting the smallest intention or desire to seize them. Yeah,
that's some story.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, and throughout his memoirs, he recounts several of these instances, and more interesting ones to come.
Yeah, and it just shows his loyalty to Napoleon and the regime. Well, let's move on then to discuss one of the more unsavory moments of his career and Napoleon's career.
Right.
The Duke of Enghien. I think this affair is kind of a mountain out of a molehill, but I know at the time it was very scandalous.
Yeah, right, definitely. Yeah.
Can you walk us through this?
Yeah. Quick overview here. So we have to recall that, by the end of the 1790s and the early 1800s, Napoleon became the target of, anti-revolutionary and royalist agitators who tried to dispose of him.
Multiple times.
Yeah, multiple times, right? And one of the most well-known events is the failed assassination attempt on Napoleon's life in the Rue Saint-Nicaise, which took place on Christmas Eve of 1800, which bolstered Napoleon's resolve to track down, the insurgents. Mm-hmm. So Savary was actually sent out to survey the French coast, and Normandy comes to mind, where British ships would land agents and financial means to bolster plots against Bonaparte's regime. So during these actions, you had a certain Captain Wright, and he was captured. So he was a Navy officer who played a role in the events. And he was the one who brought Georges Cadoudal, who was a Chouan counter-revolutionary leader from Brittany, who had to flee the country. It was Wright who brought him back to France at the cliff of Biville. Unfortunately for Wright, he was to die in mysterious circumstances. Officially, they say it was suicide, but there are some doubts. His life was ended at the Tour du Temple fortress prison in 1805. So yeah, something was definitely brewing.
Right.
So Savary actually managed to infiltrate the conspirators' meeting place. So his reports alerted the government of the importance of the scheme. And the plot also involves General Pichegru and Moreau.
Who we talked about earlier. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So Pichegru was arrested, and he also committed suicide. Again, mysterious circumstances, which took place on the 4th of April, 1804, which was also at the Tour du Temple. While Moreau had a better fate. He was exiled to the United States.
Right.
Then you have Cadoudal. He was arrested on the 9th of March of 1804, and he was sentenced to death and guillotine on the 25th of June after he refused to appeal for a pardon. So the investigations revealed that the conspirators had sought to return a prince of royal blood to France to consummate their scheme, right?
Right.
So earlier in March of 1804, Napoleon was actually resolved to arrest Louis-Antoine Henri de Bourbon-Condé, better known as the Duke of Enghien, who was the prince of by blood to the Maison de Condé, which is a French princely house and a cadet branch of the Bourbons.
Right. But he wasn't living in France at the time.
Yeah, he wasn't living in France at the time. So he was under suspicion of taking part in the plot that Cadoudal was brewing. Also, quite important to note that what were Napoleon's motives in this. So most likely the arrest was an attack aimed to intimidate and smother royalist dissent, and it was actually also employed by Napoleon to basically underline his dedication to the revolutionary cause.
Right.
But in any case, as you said, on the night of the 15th of March of 1804, there was a detachment of dragoons commanded by General Ordener. He was sent to German territory illegally, and they kidnapped the Duke at Ettenheim, and it was then brought to Strasbourg. So by the 20th of March, the Duke of Enghien was taken to Vincennes, and he was tried that same evening without any witnesses by a military commission chaired by General Hulin. And Savary, who headed the elite gendarmerie, he gathered at Vincennes as well, but he was not a member of the commission. But he did attend the deliberations. So you can say that the presence of a relative of the First Council put undeniable pressure on the commission.
Right.
So a brief interrogation in which the Duke denied that he was part of the plot, but he did boldly boasted about fighting the French Republic. He was sentenced to death. So the Duke was led to a ditch at Vincennes Castle, and he was shot on Savary's orders by a platoon of gendarmes.
Like, I totally understand Napoleon's thought process. Like, these agents have tried to assassinate me a couple of times, including a bomb that almost killed my family.
Right.
So I'm going to go, even if it's across the border, to abduct the Duke. Now, did he have to kill him? Probably not. But he wanted to send a message to these foreign agents to quit trying to assassinate me, and they did go down after that moment, if I'm not mistaken.
It's not very surprising. We also have the case of Tsar Alexander and his father. That was quite controversial, to say the least. So it was quite a thing of its time. But especially in Savary's case, it really blackened his reputation.
Right.
So in his memoirs, he devoted several pages on it to the events leading to the execution. So he, Savary indicated that his role was of a secondary nature, and he would mostly put the blame on Talleyrand. Eventually, more on that later on.
Yeah, you wonder who gave the order, though. Finally, who. I mean, obviously, everyone points to Napoleon, but you wonder about that.
Oh yeah, but I feel like mostly like the commission, right? But I do must say, I think Napoleon was quite keen to, as you said, put an end to all these events ongoing, and he basically wanted to set an example.
Right. Well, for his loyalty and abilities, Savary is appointed general of division, so he's moving up the ranks again.
Right.
And he serves in the 1805 Battle of Austerlitz. How does he do in this particular battle?
Yeah, so first, Savary was sent to Alexander with peace proposals. So his mission included, the mission was actually more of a nature to gather intelligence on enemy plans and troop strength, right?
Right, he's spying, basically.
Yeah, so by doing so, Napoleon aimed to convince his opponents too that that they were on the verge of certain victory, right? He wanted to make it seem that he was in a disadvantage at that stage, which was also which was actually kind of the case. Napoleon was really stretching his lines of communication, and the campaign. It was winter time, so not really the time to be on campaign by then.
Yeah, supplies are low. Yeah. Stuff.
So eventually, the Allies they still took the bait, and they overzealously increased demands, right? So therefore, Napoleon dismissed Prince Dolgoruki, right?
Yeah.
And so where Savary comments on saying, "quote Dolgoruki had been deficient in tact in the manner of delivering the message with which he was charged."
But I love that Napoleon seemed meek and kind of like low confidence around the Russian prince to kind of entice him to attack him.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, it really worked in like the whole plan that would lead to the Battle of Austerlitz, which is why it's such a brilliant campaign and especially like battle to study, right?
Yeah.
So for Savary's role on the 1st and 2nd of December of 1805, it was mostly related to reconnaissance. So he had to report what transpired in the field, and it was also part of the staff work. So again, I quote from his memoirs that he said, in the evening of the 1st of December, there was on our extreme right an irregular firing of small arms, which was kept up so late as to give the emperor some uneasiness. He had already sent several times to inquire whence it proceeded. So he sent for me and ordered me to go as far as the communication between the division of General Legrand and that of General Fréant, and not to return till I had ascertained what the Russians were about, and adding that this firing must be designed to cover some movement. Day of the battle itself, he recounts that the emperor sent me again to the extreme right to watch the movement of the Russians. So they began to debouch on General Legrand when I had got very near him, but on account of the fog, I could not well judge the movement. So I returned to make my report. So it was scarcely 7 in the morning. The fog had already cleared away so much that I had no reason to follow the line of the troops, lest I should lose my way. We were about 200 toises away from the Russians. So then by returning, Savary stayed close beside Napoleon throughout the action. So he was mostly a witness to the victory that brought about the War of the Third Coalition to a close.
Yeah, it's just interesting. Savary was basically all over the battlefield, both before, during, and after Austerlitz. It's just it's interesting to hear those accounts that you read there. So thank you for that. In 1806, he again serves on the front lines at the Battle of Jena and serves with distinction. Correct?
Yeah, Savary again did his part indeed. So Napoleon kept the general close at hand. Again, mostly for missions of reconnaissance and matters related to the staff. So for Jena, he explained that, and I quote again, the emperor had detached me from Gera with the 1st Regiment of Hussars to collect intelligence on the roads towards Jena. And he proposed that I should take with me Mr. Eugène Montesquieu, one of his orderly officers, who he made the bearer of a letter to the King of Prussia, and directed me to accompany him until we met the first Prussians, which took place in the valley of the Saale, above a league above Jena. And then after more descriptions, Napoleon sent out our general to partake in the maneuvers to keep the Prussians from reuniting after the battle, which resulted in that relentless French pursuit, which was spearheaded by Murat's cavalry, which had, for the most part, came to an end by the time of the capture of Lubeck and Magdeburg, which respectively ended around the 7th and 11th of November of that year. So, it's just a few weeks of like this relentless pursuit.
Yeah. The pursuit of the 3 marshals. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So there's also one of these orders that I found that Savary received from Napoleon to trail mostly of Hohenlohe's scattered forces and it dates from the 26th of October at 4 in the morning, where it says, General Savary, remain all day in your position. Go wherever your horses can carry you. If you can, go as far as Fehrbellin, where it is possible you may fall in with something. If you capture horses, send them to Spandau to mount the dragoons. And above all things, send me intelligence. And if you have anything of importance to communicate, you may forward it straight to the Grand Duke of Berg, which is Murat, who will be at Oranienburg.
Yeah.
So it's like during that onslaught, right, where Savary also manages to capture several enemy units, which belong to a Prussian general, in the wake of Marshal Soult and Bernadotte's pursuit of the well-known Prussian commander Blücher, right, who on his side of the field tried to drive the French commanders away from Berlin, and rally remnants of the Prussian army.
Yeah.
So it would even take up till the 20th of November of 1806, where then Savary managed to seize the fortress of Hamelin, which is Lower Saxony.
Yeah.
And so by that time, the Prussian army, could no longer resist. There was so much miscommunication, misinterpreted intelligence, which led them to hand over fairly defendable positions.
Yeah, they basically overrun all of Prussia in 1806.
Yeah, there's even a mention in Savary's memoirs where he would negotiate with General Schell, who was in command of the Hamelin fortress, right? So it basically, a capitulation was signed, and the troops started mutiny, and the general basically sent a message back to Savary begging him not to delay to take possession of the fortress. So it just shows in what applied the Prussians were at that.
Over 25 years ago, on September 29th, 1998, we watched a brainy girl with curly hair drop everything to follow a guy she only kind of knew all the way to college. And so began Felicity. My name is Juliette Littman, and I'm a Felicity superfan. Join me, Amanda Foreman, who you may know better as Megan, the roommate, and Greg Grunberg, who you may also know as Sean Blunberg, as the three of us revisit our favorite moments from the show and talk to the people who helped shape it. Listen to Dear Felicity on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is,
"Thank you for calling. Please listen to your list of 46 possible service options."
Which is why when you choose USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable. 24/7 online service for claims, access to roadside assistance, and more. All at the touch of a button. Start getting the service you deserve. Get a quote today. Ability to receive a quote depends on membership eligibility. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliate, San Antonio, Texas.
Yeah, and Savary seems like a smart guy, and he's working his way up the ranks, and he's performing well. And the war carries on in 1807 with Russia, and I think this is Savary's high watermark for his role as a general.
Austerlitz.
Yeah. What I like about this battle is two future marshals, Oudinot and Suchet, they weren't marshals yet, but they allowed themselves to kind of be superseded by Savary, and everyone will work together in this victory. Can you kind of talk what happens in this battle?
Yeah, for sure. I can give an overview. So by early 1807, Savary was placed at the head of the 5th Army Corps. So he replaced Marshal Lannes, who had been ill since late December of 1806. So Savary was then tasked with defending Warsaw against the Russians in the aftermath of the Battle of Eylau. So on the 16th of February, Savary would lead the French troops to battle, and he would unmistakably defeat the Russian forces of General Ivan Nikolaevich Essen. So you have to imagine that the French forces from Savary were stationed on the far right of the French line of operation. And Savary's 5th Corps was about 20,000 men strong. They were tasked with, as I said, protecting Warsaw from attacks along the Narew and the Bug River. And so he also had to secure the right flank of the French army as they moved north. So after losing the Ostro on the 3rd of February, Savary received orders to retreat from Brock towards Ostrolenka to improve the lines of communications with Napoleon's main force.
Right.
And in the meantime, Bennigsen instructed Essen to push Savary back. But then, interestingly enough, our general decided to launch an offensive himself. So that would lead to the 15th of February, where Essen, with 25,000 troops, they would march on Ostrolenka. And they advanced on both sides of the narrow river. And Savary chose to defend the town itself. So he positioned 3 brigades on low hills near Ostrolenka, the town itself, with some artillery support on the opposite bank. Mm-hmm. And in the next morning, he took the initiative and he attacked the Russian force, which was approaching from the right bank. And so early on the day of the 16th, the French forces in the advance guard under General Gazan, they clashed with the Russians at Ostrolenka itself. So Gazan was pushed back by the enemy, but the Russians then simultaneously attacked the town itself by the left bank. So French brigades led by Generals Campana and Ruffin, they had to defend Ostrolenka through fierce resistance. But then Savary sent in more reinforcements under General Rey, who was the chief of staff. But the French actually lured the Russians into the town before they unleashed like a countercharge.
Yeah, it was a rout, really.
Yeah. So the streets really became the graveyard for the Russians, and they were forced to retreat behind nearby sandhills. So then by noon, you would have French divisions led by Oudinot and Suchet arriving to bolster the French lines. And it was there that Oudinot personally led a successful cavalry charge, which caused havoc amongst the Russian Cossacks who were part of the rear guard. So the battle then, raged on with heavy fire from both sides, but the Russians were basically overwhelmed and forced to retreat. And they suffered quite some casualties. 1,300 men killed, 1,200 wounded, several general officers and members of staff on the Russian staff were killed. So it's grim evidence of their losses. While the French, on the other hand, they captured 7 guns, 2 flags. The losses were relatively light, 60 soldiers killed.
Yeah.
So General Campana was part of that, which sent Napoleon, and 400 to 500 Frenchmen were wounded. But for Savary, this was his most brilliant exploit, and he was generously rewarded, with a pension certificate, 20,000 francs, and he was appointed Grand Eagle of the Legion of Honor on the 25th of February of 1807. So
yeah, I know Napoleon was very happy with Savary in this battle, and it is interesting he was rewarded so quickly like that.
Yeah, and the point you also made about how an aide-de-camp to Napoleon could assume the marshal's type of field command, superseding generals senior in rank to him. It really proves how the French emperor could, and he actually did entrust such assignments to officers like Savary. I'm also thinking about Mouton, Rapp, Lamarrois. When those men were properly instructed, and especially in battle situations, if each of the commanders could put their egos aside for a moment, they could produce very solid results. So
and that was a good one. Well, following peace with the Russians and the Treaty of Tilsit, Savary is made a diplomat, which is a new role for him. How did he perform in this position?
Yeah, so it's like it's in the wake of the battles of Heilsberg and then Friedland. In those battles where Savary led the Fusiliers of the Imperial Guard into the fray. He first became governor of East Prussia, and then by the time of the Treaty of Tilsit in July of 1807, between the French and Russian empires, he was sent as a representative to St. Petersburg. So he was to oversee the implementation of the clauses of the treaty and more importantly also the continental system. So despite numerous friendly demonstrations by the Tsar, the Russian aristocracy in particular, they really closed their doors to Savary because they expressed their hostility to Napoleon's envoy, as he was, quote, a representative of a revolutionary nation, the murderer of a prince of royal blood. So yeah, that really sets the tone for him, right? So although he gradually managed to be tolerated, Savary continued to be very uncomfortable in the context, right? So it was also mostly due to his costumes, his candor. He had a sense of action, and they weren't really compatible with a diplomatic position. So he was recalled to Paris by the end of 1807, and he was relieved by the Master of Horse, Armand de Caulaincourt.
Caulaincourt, yeah, who was really good in that role. Yeah.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I had a really keen sense of what Russian society was like, and especially leading up to the war. He was a staunch defender of keeping, keep negotiating with them, which unfortunately wasn't heeded by Napoleon, and with all the results that followed.
So yeah, he's recalled to France. And he's made Duke of, is it Rovigo? Rovigo?
Yeah, Rovigo, right? Yeah.
And he's, even though he didn't like being a diplomat, he's showered with rewards by his emperor. And Napoleon certainly rewards loyalty, doesn't he?
Oh yeah, that's undeniably the case. Yes. So by the 7th of February, Savary was admitted to the new peerage advancement in the French Empire. And he became the Duke of Rovigo, which is a city in northeast Italy in the Veneto region. And the title came with an endowment of 15,000 francs. Then by March, the general left for Spain. So it was there that Savary again intended to prove his worth, for better and worse, because this is in the context of Spain being gripped by the political crisis. It was Napoleon who considered the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula and assigning the Spanish throne to one of his family members of importance. So troops under Murat were employed for those purposes, and Savary was dispatched to Murat to relay Napoleon's orders.
Right.
And it was actually then that Ferdinand was led to France. So by then they could install a brother of Napoleon on the throne,
Joseph.
Joseph, right? Well, and funny to know that Murat actually himself was hoping to make king by that time.
Did not work out for Spain.
That didn't really work out. Yeah. So and you would see that the Spanish, they initially expressed some sympathy because they expected the French to support Ferdinand through Napoleon's assistance, and it was actually there that Savary managed to persuade the Prince of Asturias to meet Napoleon to plead his case and assure him of his eagerness to maintain good relations with France. But we know that the negotiations, which were held at Bayonne, they were a political trap set by Napoleon, and the de facto leaders of Spain, they were prevented from intervening. Right. So by then, the Spanish royal family, they realized they were in error, and they had to they were forced up to give up control of the country.
Right.
And then by that time in Madrid, you had the 2 de Mayo, put down by Murat, and the revolt would keep on going throughout the month. And Murat was put in charge of coordinating the repression, but the latter fell ill, and he couldn't lead the French forces in the field. So Napoleon then ordered Savary to replace Murat. So again, you have the general being elevated above Marshals Bessières and Moncey, who were there and then were part of the military hierarchy.
Get back to school ready at Whole Foods Market. The Best in Class event is packed with sales on organic seedless grapes, organic Honeycrisp apples, Applegate deli meat, and more. Start your mornings with 365 by Whole Foods Market organic frozen waffles and better than cage-free eggs. Then put dinner on the table with breaded chicken nuggets, savory swordfish fillets, and fresh salad kits. Make Whole Foods Market your back-to-school destination.
It just sounds like a mess, like the whole thing, like from start to finish, the Peninsula War, which it was. But yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. As there, just the personalities in charge, they would only heed Napoleon's word, but they would interpret it differently depending on their situation, right? So it would create issues, right? So
Right.
that also resulted, for instance, in Savary opposing the French ambassador in Spain, which was Count Antoine de la Forêt. So Savary was more concerned about the needs and the welfare of the soldiers, whereas La Forêt was, he endeavored not to hound Spanish ministers by demanding excessive financial contributions, among other things. So Savary, he more sought to respond to the hostility of the Spanish population through repression and violence, where La Forêt tried to hope to win the hearts of the Spanish people through negotiation. So it just amplifies the fact that Savary was quite a poor diplomat, and he staunchly followed Napoleon's will, which then again also didn't help his already troubled reputation. Right.
Right. So, it probably happily after the invasion of Spain, Savary is brought back to France and is made Minister of Police in 1810.
Yes.
And it seems like the bar was set low with Fouché's traitorous performance as Minister of Police.
His appointment actually was a result from Talleyrand and Fouché's attempt to place Murat on the French throne.
Right.
But the coup failed by the fact that Napoleon had unexpectedly returned to Paris. As Napoleon fought a campaign against General Moore, right? So by that return, the coup failed. And the ministers, they suffered backlash from their leader, and it actually turned them to staunch opponents. So by that time, Napoleon was really desirous of a unified police force led by a more loyal servant, let's say. So given Savary's experience as a commander of the gendarmerie, he was made Fouché's replacement. Interesting enough, to complicate and significantly complicate the work of his successor, Fouché had large parts of the police archives burned down when he transferred to power. So a lot of incriminating documents were misappropriated.
Did censorship increase during this time?
So there was the censorship and strict applications of the law. They were mainly part of Savary's policy, right, during 1810, 1811. And there's some notable measures he decided on. There are many, but I can quote a few. So in Paris, for instance, there were 6 newspapers. They were reduced to 4 allowed to publish, and they were put under the supervision of agents of the ministry. Savary, for instance, had influential notables described on files according to their political beliefs, their wealth, their relations. And so you also have there's the well-known victim of the censorship of the time, and it eventually led to the exile of Germaine de Stael because of her book, the book that she had written, De l'Allemagne.
Yeah, and I know Fouché famously refused to get rid of her. He didn't do anything about Napoleon's orders to get rid of her.
Yeah. So by that time, de Stael was no admirer of Napoleon and his rule, and it actually drove her into the arms of Benjamin Constant, who would become one of the figureheads of a cosmopolitan group of individuals who actually sided against the French Empire. Right, Savary's legacy, is being branded as more severe than Fouché's, but it's related to the fact that our general had quite a rocky reputation, so he wasn't a great diplomat, and so for the most part he would stuck to the letter of what he was told to do.
Right.
Whereas Fouché, he always managed to position himself in a way that he had options available to him when matters went sideways. Right.
Well, we'll come back to his legacy here in just a minute. I'd like to discuss briefly, if we can, because I know there's a lot to it. The Malay conspiracy of 1812 October.
Right.
Napoleon's been away from the capital for months because he's in Russia on campaign. And Malay, a former general, and his conspirators spread a false rumor through Paris that the emperor has been killed in Russia. Right. Can you kind of walk us through what happens next?
Yeah. So in the morning of the 23rd of October, Malay, who was imprisoned for conspiracy, he managed to escape his place of detention early in the morning, and he actually managed to proceed to barracks of the French forces of the capital with a forged Senatus Consultum, which described that Napoleon had died in Russia and that the French Republic was refound. So, with the backing of soldiers, Malet actually headed to the La Force prison, and he demanded the release of two other generals who were also in captivity there, Lahorie and Guidal, and they joined Malet in his coup. They actually managed, very easily to get to the police ministry, and they caught Savary at his bedside.
Like literally sleeping in bed. Yeah.
Yeah, and Savary actually managed to escape death. Actually, Guidal was imprisoned on the minister's orders, so he actually was keen on getting a weapon and determining on killing him. But Lahorie managed to intervene because he was a former comrade in arms of Savary. So he was arrested and he was taken to prison by Guidal. And there were other associates of Savary, Pasquier and Desmarais. They suffered the same fate. So by then, Malet, he dealt with gullible soldiers and officials, right? And he couldn't convince General Hulin, who he met along the way, to join Malet's general staff. So in desperation, Malet shot Hulin, shattering his jaw. And by that time, luckily, there were two officials who overpowered Malet, and they rushed back to the ministry, and they also apprehended Lahorie. Savary was released, and the conspirators were basically eliminated.
And Napoleon eventually hears all this, and that's one of the reasons he has to leave the army behind in Russia, right, to get back to Paris as soon as possible.
Oh yeah, it's actually quite. It's actually quite a stunning sight, because this is happening in the power center of Napoleon's empire. So I can imagine this happening at the front back at home. Then by the time that the Russian campaign was going, this really played on Napoleon's mind. So it's actually quite a legitimate reason to return, despite leaving the army behind. But this he couldn't take, right? So he had to return back to Paris and take control. It was basically also a sign that as the master wasn't at home, things could go really badly, as it really showed.
Although Savary keeps his position as police chief, it kind of lowers his reputation, don't you think, of the all-knowing, all-powerful Savary?
Oh yeah, definitely, right? So he basically was unable to thwart the plot. So the ministry was effortlessly taken over. Savary was arrested in his sleepwear. The Parisians really made fun of his incompetence by that time, and the imprisonment. And so Savary, but also the Minister of War, Clark, the both of them, they failed to act with sufficient initiative to prevent the coup. That's for sure.
In 1813, 1814, the empire is in decline. Savary does everything he can to help the emperor with conscription and censorship. But even the loyal Savary can see that the writing is on the wall and the empire is ending, don't you think?
Yeah, we can say that, like, he started realizing this as time went on. So despite what happened with the Malet affair, Napoleon desperately needed Savary's support. So after the catastrophic withdrawal from Russia and the French defeat at Leipzig in October of 1813, the Sixth Coalition, they appeared to be on their way to defeat the Grande Armée, right? So in an effort to maintain national cohesion, Napoleon urged Savary to ensure, the enforcement of conscription, expand censorship, pursue more credible and robust propaganda. So, and a very good example of this that I had doing my research, like one of the letters that struck me was one addressed to a major in southern France, in whose community the local newspaper reported the French defeat at Vittoria of June 1813. Savary got word of it, and he urged to shut down the printing presses, and he basically instructed the major that the opposite had to be reported to the locals. So you also have to recall that, the royalist sympathy in the south of France was a thing, so he couldn't have such matters. Such matters could cause defiance against the regime. So it's a really striking example of it.
Yeah.
So by early 1814, as the campaign for France was underway, Savary made every effort to follow, his master's orders as best he could. And so the situation in the capital became, more and more critical by the day, especially by March, right? So Savary described Paris in his correspondence to Napoleon as, a city at the end of its resources. There's no more vigor. And the Allies actually, they managed to intercept such messages to Napoleon. And it was actually, one of the many reasons for them to continue the push into Paris, because that would decide the outcome of the campaign. And, it nullified Napoleon's efforts during the 6-day campaign. And, the coalition forces, they just kept up the pressure against the shaken subordinates of Napoleon. So then by the 27th of March, Mary Louise and Joseph, going against the advice of Savary and the others in the Regency, they decided to leave the capital. Right. So with that happening, Joseph, as the Lieutenant General of the Empire, he made the political misjudgment to keep Talleyrand behind in Paris.
Yeah.
So it was then Talleyrand who helped negotiating the surrender of the city alongside Marshal Marmont through the Austrians. Who was represented by Schwarzenberg, right?
Yeah, and he abdicates in April 1814, and Savary retires to his country estates. He is entrusted by the returning Bourbon royals, who think he is plotting a return of Napoleon from exile.
Correct.
And Napoleon eventually does return in 1815 to recapture the throne. Savary returns to serve under him, but notably, he gives the chief of police job to Fouché. Why do you think relations weren't as good with Savary this time, or why do you think Fouché got the job over Savary?
Yeah, so from what I get, there wasn't so much a fallout between Napoleon and Savary per se. Our general by then was really disgruntled by the events of 1814. He became a target of the royalists during the Restoration, and basically intrigue really played a role to have Fouché assume his role again as police minister. You also had Marais, who was Napoleon's longtime Secretary of State. He was also quite keen to keep Savary away from a minister position, because they had grievances in the later years of Napoleon's reign. So Fouché, by then, he managed to again position himself in such a way to become indispensable. Yeah. And also, he's simply too dangerous to remain rogue. So Savary, in his memoirs, he felt that fellow ministers and politicians, they were tricked into believing that by giving Fouché the role, he would be appeased and he would rally again to Napoleon's cause, which we all know by hindsight it was a mistake. Yeah. And Fouché was simply someone who would take paths to keep himself relevant, and he would then abandon them once his personal objectives were met, or when the political tables were turning in such a way it wasn't beneficial to him anymore. So
right. Well, Napoleon abdicates for a second and final time after the 1815 Battle of Waterloo. What was Savary's later career like?
So by the 21st of June, the news of the Battle of Waterloo silenced, the emperor's supporters. And at the Élysée Palace, Savary was one of the personalities around the emperor to have him sign the second abdication. So he then accompanied Napoleon on his way to Rochefort and board the HMS Bellerophon, with them bound to Plymouth in July of 1815. So when Napoleon arrived, close to England, the French ruler learned that he would be exiled to the island of St. Helena. Right. And the British actually allowed him to choose officers as his escort, but Savary was actually was made an exception. for his role in the Duke of Enghien affair. So yeah, his past would come to bite him in the rear end, I must say. and another victim of it was General Lallemand, because he betrayed Louis XVIII in the build-up to the 100 Days period.
Mm-hmm.
So these two generals, they were informed that they had been placed by Fouché on the infamous liste de proscription of the 24th of July 1815,
Right.
which included the banishment of Bonapartists or condemning them to death.
Right.
So,
you don't want to be on that list. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a tremendous document. So there was an arrest and a trial before a war council, awaiting the generals on their return. But however, they were taken to Malta as prisoners of war. So by then the British, they wouldn't really intend to keep two French officers in prison for life. So by late 1816, these two generals left their Maltese prison and they boarded a ship bound for Odessa, and they arrived in Smyrna at the Anatolian coast. And it was there that Savary learned the outcome of his trial in January of 1817, and where the chambers actually sentenced him to death.
Right.
So then there's a long set of Savary traveling to all parts of the Ottoman Empire, but also Austria, where he was arrested by the local authorities as he was identified there. And he was Metternich. It was actually Metternich who agreed to let the Duke of Rovigo return to Smyrna, where he then maintained trade relationships, and he had some success in that.
Right.
And he went through then an encounter with a Navy officer, a French Royal Navy officer, in April of 1819, that the French authorities were actually considering expelling him to another city within the Ottoman Empire. So by then, Savary had to bypass the Turks, and he secretly left for London. But it was actually on the advice of his family and friends that he chose to return to France to get to obtain a second sentence.
Right.
So by then, late December of 1819, there was a second trial before the War Council, and Savary was defended by Dupin, who was the lawyer who represented Marshal Ney in his own trial. But by the end of the voting, Savary was unanimously acquitted. So he was restored to his titles and dignity, but he couldn't have any duties. He wasn't given any duties, and not offered any government assignments. So by then, Savary still suffered from his unfavorable reputation amongst the royalists, right? So they kept on blaming him for the execution of the Duke of Enghien. So he therefore decided to have his view of the facts published.
Well, what's interesting, though, jumping ahead, in 1830, he kind of comes back into favor after the July Revolution, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. So he had an Italian interlude. He spent a few years there, and by then he learned that news reached him that Charles X had abdicated, and there was the establishment of the July monarchy. So he returned to France and he offered his services to Louis Philippe. So Savary returned to a position of commander of French forces as a result of the campaign that was led in Algeria. So he was ordered to conquer the coastline and gain control of the interior with the assistance of the local tribes. But things went very bleak in the colonies. There were issues with the intendant that was in charge, Pichon. They had to share authority, but knowing Savary, again, quite tumultuously, they had issues and they didn't cease. So the intendant had to be placed under Savary's command. So as much as there was construction of new infrastructure, it was nevertheless accompanied by colonial violence, mainly executions, instigated through the actions of sheikhs and Mamluk leaders. And it was actually Savary's rule who destabilized the region quite considerably, and it even led to July 1833, a report of parliamentary commission of inquiry, it clearly condemned Savary's policy there.
He dies in Paris in June 1833. I'd like to talk about his legacy because it's so up and down throughout the empire and after the empire. What do you think his legacy is?
Yeah, it's definitely a curious one. So while his reputation, is that, especially in France, of like a ruthless figure, that looms large, we can have like a bit of a nuanced picture too, because, undoubtedly, the significant stain on Savary's record is his involvement in the execution of the Duke of Enghien. And the controversial event simply fueled like public perception of Savary as like a bloodthirsty enforcer, willing to carry out Napoleon's darkest desires.
Right.
So the public's lack of knowledge about the nature of these, quote unquote, dark deeds, they only amplified the fear surrounding him. So then you have like Savary's role as Minister of Police. It encompassed, a wide range of activities, that encompassed more than just executions, right? It was a murky world of diplomatic intrigue, where he orchestrated, for instance, the removal of the Spanish royals. He oversaw a system of censorship, interrogation, imprisonment, exile.
Right.
There's like an involvement in control of information, suppression of dissent. It undoubtedly contributed to his reputation, his fearsome reputation. But so despite all the actions, right, betraying Savary as simply evil, that's maybe overly simplistic. So by the end of the day, he was undoubtedly, he undoubtedly served as a loyal and effective tool for Napoleon's ambitions, right? So it's an evidence, it's evidence that suggests his motivations weren't only bloodlust. He had more of, there was more of like a pursuit of wealth and position, and his genuine devotion to Napoleon, they appear to be the more central driving forces, I must say. It's a mix, to say the least, it's a mixed bag, that's for sure.
Yeah, because clearly, loyalty was driving his efforts, but he wrote a memoir, so clearly he was able to self-reflect, and maybe during his role as chief of police or even general, maybe he should have thought, well, maybe I shouldn't be doing some of these things.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. Like we must remember too, like his memoirs are actually, they're available online, and they've been translated into English. So if you can read them, I can highly recommend them.
Wonderful.
Do be warned. It's a Bonapartist view, and he's a huge fan of the emperor.
Right.
But to say the least, to have like insights of of the police work and all the intrigue that revolved Napoleon's reign, they can provide quite some insights.
That was great, Jonas. I appreciate the overview on Savary, and that was fascinating. And again, I'd like to remind all my listeners to go to napoleonchronicles.wordpress.com, where you can see Jonas's information. And he's also active on Twitter, Facebook. You can follow him there, and he has some really great posts on the era. So I highly recommend that.
Thank you so much, John, especially for your time. It was great to give some insights on this fascinating character around of Napoleon's staff.
Yeah, indeed. And Jonas, it was great having you on. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.